On today's show, we're joined by Locked On Raptors host Sean Woodley for a deep dive on all things Fred VanVleet. How did his career play out with the Raptors? What was ultimately the reason for him leaving Toronto? What does he bring to the Houston Rockets from the offensive side of the basketball, the defensive side of the basketball, as a leader, and so much more? It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
Throw it up to Jalen Green.
Sengun here in the short row. Oh, my, that's the no-look.
Jabari for three and the win. Yeah!
Look at Tari, Eason.
Here comes Tari. Oh!
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
The Houston Rockets select Thompson and Cam Whitmore.
One thing I have never done is not made the playoffs, and so we want to take that step here as well.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin. And the show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you listen to your podcast, including YouTube. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on the way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for making LOR part of your day every single day. Joining us now for a deep dive on all things Fred VanVleet is Sean Woodley, the host of Locked On Raptors. You can track down on Twitter at WoodleySean, and wherever you listen to your podcast, just search Locked On Raptors. Sean, so excited to have you here on the show for, just to help us get a better understanding of who Fred VanVleet is, the guy that the Rockets just signed to this massive deal to bring to Houston to help kind of spearhead the charge into what they're effectively calling phase 2 of their rebuilding plan, ushering in this new age of Rockets basketball. So let's start with just how would you best describe Fred's tenure with the Raptors if you had to kind of sum it up for us?
I mean, it's sort of clouded by the end, because the last season in Toronto, it was weird. The vibes were strange. He was in a contract year. There was stuff about role, and the fan base got like super duper weird about him, which we're not going to get into because it was just like kind of a toxic experience just talking about Fred VanVleet on the internet for the entire season, which was no fun. But overall, I mean, he's one of the 7 best players in Toronto Raptors history, and he is very emblematic of what the Raptors did well during their run to the championship and in the couple of years after. He was an undrafted guy. He was one of their first sort of products of their excellent G League system where they churned out NBA players over and over again. And he just kind of added more every single year. It was ascendant, if you're looking for one word. Like, it was just like kind of year over year, there was just a little bit more Fred VanVleet, and it was a delight to watch, honestly. A super fun guy. Also, you're in for a treat as a media guy, because he is the single best quote I think I've ever encountered in an NBA locker room. He's amazing. He's so well thought. He's so thoughtful. He's well spoken. He is honest. He will not mince words, and you're going to have a great time covering him. He was one of the faces of the Raptors. He was one of the pillars of a very successful era for the team. Yes, he was more of a role player on the teams that really hit the higher upper echelon of success, but even then, he started on a team that was on a 60-win pace before COVID ruined everything. He was just a huge emblematic piece, very much symbolic of a lot of the good things the Raptors did for a very, very long time. And he's going to be missed for that reason. Like, he's a pretty massive figure to try to replace in Toronto.
It's so funny that you said that he's going to be an amazing quote, because DeMichael also said the exact same thing about Dillon Brooks. So now it's going to be so funny to see which one of them ultimately winds up having the best quotes. Maybe I'll make that like a recurring segment on the show, like the VanVleet versus Brooks, quote of the week or something. You talk about this past season, right? And how things were just a bit, toxic, dysfunctional, whatever you want to call it, in Toronto. How much of that do you feel like either stemmed from Fred, maybe unhappiness in his role? Was it just other things? And how much of that played into his decision to ultimately leave rather than stay in Toronto? Was it all about the money? Was it just about the situation? What was the ultimate reason for his departure?
It's honestly, there's a lot of gray area with this, right? Because I don't think the blame for last season falls on any one person with the Raptors. I don't think his decision to leave falls on any one real factor. There's a lot of different things at play. I think for me, there was a very clear rift, it seemed, between Fred VanVleet, Pascal Siakam, and Scotty Barnes, and the sort of older and younger faction of the team. And frankly, I never once blamed Fred VanVleet for maybe taking it personally that this guy who is an all-star and is, built himself from nothing into an NBA player who makes $43 million a year. I had no problem with Fred VanVleet not wanting to just simply hand the keys over to a 21-year-old who had one good season, but didn't really, carry it over to his second year. He wasn't fantastic. Scotty Barnes was not in his second year. He was good. Like, there was lots of stuff to like, a lot of stuff to dislike. And I think he was kind of, as a whole, basically a similar player to what he was as a rookie, just in a different kind of form. But either way, I think there's maybe this sort of idea that Scotty Barnes was going to walk in and the team was going to be his and that it was all going to flow around him. And it was an understandable bit of tension, I think, where you have this guy who clearly the most raw talent on the team in Scotty Barnes comes in, has a rookie of the year season. I understand why Scotty Barnes might have thought, hey, this is my team now. And I also get why Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam, to maybe a lesser extent, were like, no, it's still our team. We've made All-Stars and All-NBAs and won championships. You can learn from us. And it was a tension that was almost unavoidable, I think, just with the concoction they had of players in the room and just sort of the weird situation the roster was in. I guess it's like, I've never been super of the mind that every team has to have every player be the same age. The whole timeline thing to me is like, okay, that's nice and clean and 2K-ish if you want, but real teams have good young and old players and players in between. And that's, all the best teams have a wide range of that. And so I was never worried about the timeline stuff, but when you have personalities that clashed the way it seemed they did, and a coach in Nick Nurse who didn't exactly do a good job of laying out the hierarchy of the team and declaring what roles were going to be, on top of the front office not assembling much of a roster beyond 7 players, it just led to a whole lot of just sort of bad feelings all around. I think you play that season again. I think you sort of, if Nick Nurse had a bit of a different approach to it, maybe there's a more successful version of last year's Raptors team that you tap into, but maybe not, because the roster wasn't totally suited and Scotty Barnes wasn't ready for the team to be his. Either way, the tensions were there all season long. And I think I never once begrudged Fred VanVleet for being like, okay, 21-year-old, take the team. It's yours now. It was a totally understandable thing, but that is, I think, really the undercurrent of what caused last season to kind of fall apart for the Raptors.
That's not exactly super encouraging words to hear, because he's coming to a team where he's got a bunch of 20-year-olds that he, at least as far as Rockets fans expect to see how they expect the season to go, is he's going to take a bit of a backseat to them, is at least how Rockets fans kind of want this to look, right? With Jalen Green being the number one option, Alperen, Sengun, Jabari Smith Jr. So with that tension between Fred and Scotty, and maybe that expectation on Scotty's behalf of like, okay, I'm taking over the team, it's my team now, whatever. I mean, did you at least see, like, was Fred at least still a leader and still a mentor to some of the other young guys, to Scotty and other young guys on the team? Or is this maybe a potential problem that we're going to be facing here in Houston if Fred doesn't necessarily want to take a backseat to Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun and Jabari Smith Jr. and just be that veteran mentor to help usher in the new age here in Houston?
No, I still think Fred's a pro, right? Like he still had plenty of good things to say about Scotty Barnes and talked a lot about, like, glowingly about his potential and what he can be. I just think he wasn't there ready to just crown him right away. And I think that's honestly, if you're the young Rockets players, you should probably have the mindset of, this guy has made however many $200 million of NBA money in his career at this point. He's been an all-star. He's been a champion. He's got all this stuff under his belt. Maybe we should listen to him and kind of take his guidance. I think, if anything, the Rockets badly need that after what the last couple of years have been, how directionless it's felt. I think if you're the young guys on the Rockets, you should be embracing the idea of a guy with the experience and the skill set of Fred VanVleet walking in and kind of being the guy who runs the show. And frankly, I think he's going to stand a pretty good chance of being just like a really good table setter for that Rockets team. Yes, Jalen Green might be the number one option, but I would much rather have Fred VanVleet starting possessions and initiating than Jalen Green at this point. And I think the Rockets will be at their best if Fred VanVleet is doing that, and he's there to kind of butter the bread, as it were, of the younger guys and get them into spots to succeed. I'm a huge Sengun guy. I love him very, very much. And I think him and Fred VanVleet are going to be an awesome duo. I think he probably stands, of any Rockets player, to benefit the most from the arrival of Fred VanVleet, who's gotten much better as a pick and roll operator in the last couple seasons. He's still not perfect. He's not a great lob passer, stuff like that, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be a thing him and Sengun are hooking up for. And so I think there's going to be a lot of positives of just having an adult in the room for that Rockets team. And Fred VanVleet, over the course of his career, has very much been that. He's been a mentor to guys. He has been the leader of the locker room, even without being maybe the best player. Pascal Siakam has been the best player on the Raptors the last couple of years. I'd still think you'd say Fred VanVleet was the biggest, loudest voice in the room, and he's very good at that stuff. I think there was just a lot of stuff last year with the Nick Nurse on down, injuries, just like a strange team hierarchy, a starting lineup with 5 dudes who wanted the ball. Like, it was just like a weird concoction of bad vibes with the Raptors last year that I think the Rockets should be able to avoid. But yeah, if he walks in and all the young guys are like, screw you, Fred, the ball's ours. Yeah, there could be some problems. But I think if they're smart and Ime Udoka has like a pretty good plan in place, they're going to take their cues from Fred, and Fred's going to be there to help them take the next steps in their careers.
Coming up, what kind of an offensive and defensive impact can we expect from Fred VanVleet with the Rockets, as well as other elements of his game, like his leadership that he brings to the table, his fit with the team? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5, just $5, and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet just $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props, over-unders, and so much more. Right now, you can take a look at the outright Super Bowl 58 favorites, the Kansas City Chiefs at plus 600, the Eagles at plus 800, the Bills at plus 900, and rounding out the top 5, if the Bengals and 49ers at plus 1,000 points apiece. The Texans, unfortunately, all the way down at plus 18,000, but go ahead and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss out on. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, a crossover episode with our good friend Sean Woodley from Locked On Raptors for all things Fred VanVleet. Now, Sean, when we look at let's start with the offensive side of the ball. You talked there momentarily in segment 1 about just Fred being this table setter, right? And I think there's this maybe, I don't want to say a misconception about him, but this idea that he's not necessarily your traditional table-setting point guard, especially when you look at how his role has evolved over the years with the Raptors, from where he came from, what his role was kind of on the championship-era teams, and then to where it is now. What would you say to those who are concerned that he's not exactly the best fit to be the guy who is the table setter for this team?
I mean, I think the last couple of years have shown he can absolutely do it, right? Like, he'll routinely walk into 8, 9, 10 assist games. He's gotten much better as a pick and roll passer, and he's really one of the best guys at driving and kicking for 3-point opportunities elsewhere. He's not really going to score at the rim. Don't expect him to have a good percentage around the rim. He's like 5'11" and has a lot of trouble scoring around the basket. He's got a lot of English he'll throw up there. And my friend Joe Wolfond over at The Score has coined Fred VanVleet as either the best bad finisher or the worst good finisher in the NBA, however you want, based on the given day. But that's the way you can expect around the basket. But when it comes to setting other guys up, I think the reputation has I'm surprised he's not viewed as a better sort of table setting point guard. I think there was a lot of like, he doesn't pass enough to Scotty Barnes stuff with the Raptors this past year, and Raptors fans got mad about that. I don't really care about that. I think he did a good job setting the table. You saw when Jakob Poeltl arrived in particular, the pick and roll combination of Jakob Poeltl and Fred VanVleet was one of the best duos in the entire NBA at producing productive possessions. Say that 5 times fast. He's got it, right? Is he Kyle Lowry? No. Is he like Chris Paul? No, he's not a perfect player like that. But guess what? He also brings a lot as an off-ball player as well. And what he really made his name for with the Raptors was being one of the, if not the single best catch and shoot 3-point shooters in the NBA. He can run around off screens. He can hang out off the ball in the corner, on the wing, whatever it might be, and take advantage of other guys who, draw attention from the defense. And he can really burn you there as well. Ask the Milwaukee Bucks in 2019 exactly about Fred VanVleet as an off-ball scorer too. He can kind of do it all. And so if there are going to be pockets of games where Jalen Green's taking over or Kevin Porter Jr. is taking over, Fred VanVleet can absolutely play off the ball. I would have liked to have seen him occupy that role a little bit more last season, honestly, especially before they had Jakob Poeltl on the team. I think his 3-point shooting and spacing was really valuable, but he also brings a lot to the table just with his pull-up 3-point shooting. No, he was not an amazing 3-point shooter last year, just 34-ish%, well below his career standards. But the volume he brings and the pull-up 3-point shooting he brings, where he was about 34% on pull-ups on like 4.5 attempts a game last year, that matters. That bends defenses, and that in the modern NBA is like the single most important table-setting element you can have outside of like good pick and roll passing is, can you bend the defense with your pull-up threat? And Fred VanVleet can absolutely do that. He can be someone who runs effective offense with good offense around him. You know, the Raptors struggled because they didn't really have any bigs, and they didn't really have any shooting, and they didn't really have anything outside of, like isolating and trying to like just bludgeon dudes via matchups. The Raptors' half-court offensive ecosystem was, I think, a lot worse than what this Rockets one looks like, with Jabari Smith Jr. bombing threes and Sengun and Green and all of this. So I feel pretty good that he's going to be someone in that construct of that team who's going to be able to set the table just fine. And if he's not having a good time with it, or there's other guys who you want to get more touches to, he can 100% play off the ball and be very effective there as well.
I think the element of Fred VanVleet playing off the ball is really exciting, because obviously the Rockets are bringing him in. They want a table setter. They want a veteran to really kind of orchestrate things for these young guys. But when you look, as you already alluded to, right, you've got Jalen Green, you've got Kevin Porter Jr., you've got Amin Thompson that you just drafted, you've got Alperen Sengun who you can run offense through. All these different threats, you know, all these different guys who could have the ball in their hands and who can create themselves a little bit. Having a point guard who can take, 3 or 4 possessions in a row, setting the table for other guys, but then have 3 or 4 possessions in a row where he plays off ball, he spaces the floor, he's well beyond the 3-point arc and really stretching that defense out. That is going to be invaluable, especially if he feels that that's an important element of his game. Is that something that like, has he talked about that before? Is he comfortable playing off ball? I know he's done it a lot, but you also talk about this past season, how he did it significantly less. And you would think that in a world where he's playing alongside a Scotty Barnes type, that he would be maybe, amenable to playing off ball, because that's how you get the best out of that duo specifically.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough thing to figure out, right? Because like I've always thought Fred's best role is playing off the ball. And that very much played itself out when Kyle Lowry was still on the team, right? And he was the go-to point guard. There was no question. He did almost by necessity have to become the lead point guard, the guy who had the most touches, all this stuff. And I think, it's hard to say, right? Like, I don't think he took kindly to the idea of playing off ball last year, just because I think that was fair. They didn't have someone else who was as good as him as a point of attack creator. He was just fine playing off ball when Kyle Lowry was doing his thing back in 2019-20, when he was playing like out of his mind for an entire year. Fred was great off the ball. And so I think it depends on the context of the team. Like, it depends on the way the coaching staff sets expectations. Like, I just don't think that happened with the Raptors last year. Like, I don't think Nick Nurse gave enough direction of, hey, this is your job, this is your job, go do it well. I think it was very kind of willy-nilly, go figure it out by yourselves. And Fred VanVleet looked around and said, well, there's no other point guards on this roster. I guess I'm just going to play point guard and have the ball a bunch. That can lead to some, iffy possessions, right? And it's hard to separate bad decision making from Fred's and just like awful offensive context on the Raptors end, because the Raptors did not have a whole lot going on offensively for long stretches last year. They didn't have a pick and roll big man for the first 2/3 of the season. They didn't have enough shooting, and so it led to a lot of Fred VanVleet possessions where he would kind of dribble for 18 seconds and not create a whole lot. But will that be different on a team with more space and dynamism off the ball and a center in Sengun who can kind of do a bunch of different things? I think it probably will. So yes, he does have those sort of pound the ball into the ground tendencies at times, but I also think a lot of that is tied to the context of the team he was playing on in the Raptors. And so we'll see. I think it is just the situation with Toronto last year was so bizarre, so clunky, so weird. It's tough to get a full read on like, what is Fred right now? What does he want to be? And so it'll be very telling, I think. But I think if there's like a direction and a plan going in, and there is, like top down sort of agreement as to how he's going to be used, he's going to be just fine. It was, I think, a lot of, the sort of the backroom dealings with the Raptors last year it was just not a healthy environment for conducive, cooperative, cohesive basketball. And so that's kind of my best read on the situation. It is hard to say because there are those tendencies to over dribble, to not want to play off the ball. But again, I think team context has a lot to do with that.
Let's shift gears here and go to the defensive side of the basketball for a moment. I think one thing that Rockets fans are incredibly excited about is just the overall upgrade in defensive intensity that we're going to see this next season with adding Fred VanVleet, adding Dillon Brooks, two of the most premier point of attack defenders in the league. What does Fred bring on the defensive side of the basketball?
So this is, if you were of the mind that the Raptors should have just let Fred VanVleet walk last year, and, obviously some people were happy that happened because some people are dumb. But I think him leaving for nothing is objectively a bad thing for the Raptors. It's not good. But if you were on the side of, maybe it's time to just not have Fred on the team anymore, trade him at the deadline or whatever, I think a lot of it was tied to the defensive decline, because at the point of attack last year, he was not good. He was a very bad point of attack defender, got blown by a ton, looked a little bit slow. He started the season off, with some injuries and some illness that probably played into that a little bit. He's dealt with back and leg injuries and stuff, and sort of the toll of being a 5'11" point guard who has a lot of usage in the NBA. It adds up over time. Not to mention he was playing like the most minutes in the league for Nick Nurse on account of no other point guards on the team. So it is hard to say whether the decline is truly coming, but I do think if there is decline right now, I'm much more confident in his offense still kind of maintaining a level of competence than I am in his defense, just as a point of attack guy. As a team defender, he's bloody incredible. He is probably the best guard at digging down from the wing, from the perimeter, to go for steals, to pull balls away, to, he would rack up blocks like crazy during his last couple of years in Toronto. But they weren't blocks. They were him just kind of digging in and stealing it on the way up for a guy trying to
recorded as a block, but it's basically a deflection.
Exactly. Okay. He would have led the NBA in steals and I think he was close a couple of years anyway, but he would have led the league in steals by a mile if those blocks were actually called the steals that they kind of were. Either way, unimportant, but it's not unimportant because that speaks to the incredible off-ball instincts that he has as a defender. Again, point of attack, it got a little better when Jakob Poeltl was there to kind of clean up messes at the end of last season, but if you don't have a proper rim protector behind him, I think that's where his biggest decline is shown, is that lateral quickness, that ability to stick with faster guards at the point of attack. They would get roasted by really quick guards pretty routinely, to the point that they would have to stick like OG Anunoby or Precious Achiuwa on a guy like Trae Young or someone like that, because Fred just couldn't really hang as a one-on-one on an island defender. But again, the off-ball stuff is great. It's bloody impressive. He's got iron fists, like the heaviest hands that you'll ever see. And that is a really fun thing. That ignites transition. That gets them kind of running and all that stuff. But yeah, point of attack, I would temper your expectations, maybe with a lessened minutes load and less total overall burden as an offensive player as well. Maybe he's able to get that a step back there. But if the decline has come, it's 1,000% been as a point of attack defender. And that, I think, was one of the biggest reasons why Raptors fans were maybe okay in some corners with him moving on.
We recently had Mike Guevara, who is Fred's fitness trainer, his NBA. Why am I blanking on the official terminology for this? I'm like, it's not his skills coach, but the guy that makes sure his body is right. And he was on the show recently, and he was talking about
muscle watcher.
There we go. Yeah, that. I'm so sorry, Mike. My bad, man. But we recently had him on the show, and he was talking about all the work that Fred was putting in this offseason to make sure that his knee was right, that his body was good going into this next year. So hopefully, from a health perspective, there's nothing there limiting him as he's coming into this season for the Rockets. Because again, they do need a significant improvement on the defensive side, but just the team defense element is going to be massive as well, even if there is a bit of a decline as far as just the individual one-on-one point of attack defense, because the Rockets just as a team were abysmal defensively last year. So having better, more high IQ guys who understand rotations and how to help and how to teach others how to be good defensively is going to it's going to pay significant dividends this upcoming season. But coming up, I want to get into Fred's best and worst games from this past year so that Rockets fans can get a better idea of what to expect from him, as well as how does he succeed in this role with Houston. We're going to get there in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, chatting with Sean Woodley of Locked On Raptors. Now, Sean, if Rockets fans wanted to go and get a better idea of the Fred VanVleet that is going to be donning a Rockets jersey here in the not so distant future, about a month and a half to training camp, I guess. What games would you suggest for them to go check out for maybe a couple of his best games from this past season and a couple of his worst games from this past season to get an idea of who they're getting?
So I think, go and look at the box scores and just look at his 3-point totals. And if he'll have games where he goes 2 of 13 and it's not pretty, he's someone who's going to really jack him up. And that's a good thing. Like, you want 3-point volume, and the Raptors desperately needed his 3-point volume. I don't know if he'll average 9 attempted threes a game on the Rockets this season, like he did for the Raptors, just because it was a necessity for him to do that. But there are games, I think in particular, the play-in game against the Bulls, just couldn't find it. Could not. I don't have the box scores in front of me at the moment, but just could not find it. And he can have lopsided shooting nights that, for a team that was so dependent on his 3-point shooting, it was devastating. I don't think it'll be as big a problem for the Rockets, just because they seem to have a little bit more 3-point shooting talent on the team than the Raptors did. But it is certainly a thing. He can definitely shoot you out of a game on his bad nights, right? Where he'll just kind of, 12, 2 of 13, 1 of 13, 1 of 11, whatever. Those nights will happen. The nice and sort of saving grace there is there were plenty of games this season where he would have those really bad shooting nights, and then you'd get down to crunch time and he would hit his second 3 of the game to go 2 of 15, but it was the biggest shot of the game, right? He's kind of got that sort of, it's onions time thing where he kind of step up with it. But yeah, that's sort of where you're looking for where the games are not good. It's when the 3-point shooting is off, because he's very dependent on it, right? He's not someone who's going to go and score a ton at the rim. He can't just decide, okay, it's not working for me 3-point wise, let me just go score a bunch and get a bunch of buckets in close. It's just not going to work that way. He does have a bit more of a mid-range game, excuse me, which he can kind of lean on, and has become a bit more of an element, sort of a counter for him in the last couple of years, something he can go to when those threes aren't falling. But he's 5'11", and he is a good 3-point shooter with high volume. He's going to be susceptible to variance there for sure. The best games, just go look at any game where he played the Utah Jazz. For some reason,
is he a Jazz killer? Because that's a total bonus if he's a Jazz killer.
Total Jazz killer. Yes, I think his only career triple-double was against the Jazz this season. It was 30, 10, and 10 or something like that. It was a really impressive performance. But yeah, the games where he's at his best, it's when he's setting other guys up, for sure. It's when there's a little bit more catch and shoot to his game. And it's when the threes are falling, right? It's very reductive, but it's very 2023 in the NBA to say when the threes are falling, it's good. When the threes aren't falling, it's not so good. But yeah, also you can just go watch the game where he scored 54 against the Magic back in 2021. That was a delight. It was the only good thing that happened for the Raptors during the Tampa Bay season. And if you want to see Fred totally go off, the sort of peak of Fred on a heater, that's the game to go and watch for sure.
Man, he also had a game, I believe, last year that I pulled the highlights from right after the Rockets signed him, where he just torched Houston, and he ripped KPJ 4 times in one game. And I was like, look, this man is going to be competing against KPJ and Jalen in practice, and they are going to be getting absolutely muscled by this guy every single day.
They're going to hate it. Yeah, they're going to be miserable.
Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that you need, right? You need iron sharpens iron, right? When it comes to these young guys, and having a vet like Fred who can come in and really bully these 2 young guys around and be like, no, you guys think you're hot stuff. You're really not. I got you. I got you on an island and you're mine. And it's going to be so much fun to see how those guys develop, and Amin Thompson and so many of the other players on this roster, with just having him around, right? Having more competitive practices, games that ultimately matter deeper into the season is another benefit to where this Rockets team is hopefully headed this next season. I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, Sean, but just as a leader, how is Fred viewed by the other players on his team? I know we've touched on, kind of the Scotty tension a little bit, but, how is he viewed as a leader by, Nick Nurse, by the other players, by Pascal? And how did his voice carry in that locker room?
Yeah, again, I think it's a little cloudy because this last year, I think maybe his messaging or whatever maybe ran a little thin, or again, there's so many weird factors at play that it's hard to really pinpoint who's to blame, all this stuff. But prior to that, fully, totally embraced as the leader of the team. When Kyle Lowry left, there was this sort of concern of, oh God, Kyle Lowry's been the face of the team for all this time. And I remember They interviewed Fred in the final game of the season, where it was like Kyle's last year. It was the final game of the Tampa season, I believe. And he just like the way he spoke and the way others speak about him, it really was like, oh yeah, no, the Raptors are in good hands. This is going to be fine. Like this is like, he's someone who can kind of command respect within a room. And I think that makes sense, right? Like this is a guy who was an undrafted player who bet on himself multiple times, has now earned over $200 million in contracts in his career. That's incredible. And a testament to the kind of dude he is, the work he puts in, all that stuff. And so I think just like his story on its own commands respect. Again, the factors last year with the Raptors, it's hard to really parse, where things went wrong and who was at fault the most. But overall, I think for the most part, he has been universally seen as like a tremendous leader. And again, as like a media person, it's really refreshing to hear someone like, and maybe the young guys don't like this. Maybe it's like a generational gap thing where it's like, oh, you're going to tell the truth about how he sucked. What the hell? Fred VanVleet's not going to be afraid to tell the truth when they suck. And I think that is a valuable thing to have. And I think, the media, again, is going to have an absolute ball just talking with him because he is very forthright. He is very honest. Maybe that doesn't sit with the 21-year-olds of today, but it should probably, like he knows what he's talking about. He's been there. He's been through a lot and he's won a championship and he's got all this stuff under his belt when he never should have as a guy who was undrafted out of college. And so, yeah, I think under the right circumstances that essentially not last year's Raptors circumstances, Fred VanVleet is viewed as a pretty universally fantastic leader. And I would have no doubt that things are going to go pretty well in Houston.
Well, there's a pretty, the bar is set pretty high, I should say, for having to drop, I guess, a candid comment because we have Eric Gordon from New Year's Eve last season saying that there's been no improvement on the roster. So if Fred can somehow top that comment, I will be thoroughly impressed. Hopefully, though, there's not a train wreck situation going on next season where he has to drop a comment like that. Sean, last thing that I've got for you here, when we look at Fred and kind of him integrating himself into this young Rockets roster, you came in and you were incredibly optimistic about his future with this Rockets team and what he's going to be able to accomplish with some of these young guys. How do you envision a successful season for Fred looking? Like when you look at the different parts that the Rockets have, how does he come in here and have success?
Yeah, I think you probably want to see his volume be a little bit lower than it was with the Raptors last year. Again, very much by necessity because they didn't have a whole lot in terms of guys who could dribble, pass, and shoot. They have less of them now because he's gone and they didn't really replace him with one. So except for old Rockets pal Dennis Schroeder, baby. I think with Fred, yeah, maybe you drop the volume back a little bit. I think in particular, if they can scale his minutes back to like 33 a game as opposed to 37, 38, which he's been at the last couple of years, I think that's going to be huge for him just to kind of give him some extra pop and juice. And frankly, he's always at his best when he's able to kind of get downhill. Again, he's not scoring at the rim all that well, but he's getting into the teeth of the defense. He's Steve Nashing the pick and roll, all that stuff. And I think that's just a lot easier when he's got more juice in the tank or gas in the tank, juice in the box. I don't know what the analogy I'm looking for here is, but you get my where I'm going with it. I think if he can, I don't see why he can't come in and not average like 7 or 8 assists a game and kind of be someone who's just hooking up dudes, Sengun, Green, Smith on down the line. Like I think he can really be someone who puts those guys in a position to succeed. And if that happens, I think his numbers will be there. I think just the threat of his shooting is going to be a useful thing to help open up the offense as well. And I think, that's the recipe here. Defensively, I don't know if there's enough like insulation there defensively. I know that Dillon Brooks is a great wing defender. I'm not sure anyone else on that team is a great defender. And so there might not be enough there to make it so Fred VanVleet's going to be, a no-brainer ace defensive player or anything like that. Like, I don't think he's competing for all defense anymore, but still the off-ball stuff, the team defense, sort of conducting things, even if he physically can't stay in front of guys as well as he used to, I think that's all going to be very valuable too. And I think will kind of contribute to a successful Fred VanVleet. Like, again, he's just an adult, right? Like, he's an adult in the room. And I think if he is given the platform to be said adult, it's going to be a pretty successful year for him.
I know I said last thing when I asked you that question, but this just popped in my mind. What it has been to this date your favorite Fred VanVleet Drake interaction, seeing as how they're
Fred
twins?
VanVleet Drake interaction? Honestly, Drake hasn't been around the last few years, so it's hard to really think of one. I guess like Drake, like just like tweeting about his brother. I don't know. There's not many good ones. Like Drake
okay,
has
all right, fair.
Not many great interactions with the players themselves. He's usually at Kentucky games. But like, as far as like
I just remember Drake calling Houston the Guangdong Rockets, like when Fred signed here, and I was like, damn, like that's brutal, man.
Like, yeah, they definitely like have a back and forth. Do I think that Fred likes Drake as much as Drake likes Fred, or thinks Fred likes him? Probably not. But you know, that's no reporting. That's just inferring from the way they talk about one another. But yeah, as far as like favorite Fred moments and stuff like that, I mean, there's plenty of them. Like he had the 54-point game against Orlando. He had just like a tremendous turnaround in the playoffs back in 2019, where he was awful for the first 2.5 rounds. Then he had a kid came back and hit 17 of 19 threes to close the conference finals, and was amazing enough to get a finals MVP vote in 2019. Shout out Hubie Brown. You know, all that. He's a really fun player, and I think Rockets fans are going to have a pretty good time with him. And you won't have to deal with Drake, which is always fun.
There we go. Always a win there. Sean, thank you so much for stopping by. Let everybody know where they can track you down at, man.
Yeah, Locked On Raptors every day. Find it on your podcast apps and YouTube. I'm on Twitter very sparingly, because who wants to be on Twitter? At Woodley Sean. You can find the show on Instagram and all that good stuff. So thanks for having me on, man.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast, or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.